Kids can go up, follow Kate, and then if any young adults can stay, it's fine. I mean, I think this is important stuff. And of course, as opposed to our speaker on Sunday night, I'll watch my mouth. So let's do that. And then maybe, Marla, I know you just sat down. I apologize. Can you just close that door back there? And then Chris, if we can close that door over there. So what this class began is over the years, and starting when I was a seminary professor, I've noticed how Christians have tended to think about Lent, and it's been a kind of set way of moving towards Easter Day. Lent is a time of fasting. It goes for 40 days and 40 nights. There is a set number of collects that you do, and each of those collects is meant to approach one aspect of your life, whether it's this past Sunday we looked at temptation, and in the future a couple of collects we're going to look at things like renewal and penance and refreshment and grace. And these are meant to kind of create a way for us to walk in our lives. And it tends to bring to the fore certain things that we're supposed to do to get right with God. And standing behind all of this is a basic theology that the action of Easter and Holy Week happens on Good Friday. The moment that Jesus hangs on the cross and draws all the world to himself, as we read in the Gospel of John, the moment in which he offers a sacrifice for our sins, which is a powerful way of reconciling us to God. The minute when Jesus does that incredible expression of divine love, that is really the apex, that's the culmination, that's the climax of the story. And then Easter is the anticlimax. There's this moment, it's a little bit unusual. We're supposed to be excited, but there's all sorts of fuzziness about Easter. And this began to get to me probably about 15 years ago. I began to wonder, why is it that we don't see Easter as the climax, Easter as the big bang moment, the moment that is the culmination of things? And what I realized is that actually the way that we've been practicing as a church is actually kind of recent. It started in the 4th century, to our knowledge. So this pilgrim went and traced what was happening in Jerusalem, and she wrote a kind of diary of her journeys. Egeria was her name. And in it, she was noticing the whole practice of the veneration of the cross in Jerusalem, and that kind of became the template through which everybody has been looking at Easter. So it started in the 4th century. It started 400 years or so after the birth of Christ. And I began to think about what would it mean for us to see Easter and resurrection as key. Easter and resurrection as the climax of the story. Easter and resurrection as the point of the story. And I actually wrote a journal article about this. It was published in the Anglican Theological Review. I know that you will all rush out and read it, but it's a hot off the press. 2012, I think I wrote it. Maybe even earlier, 2007. Gosh. And what I argue is this, that there could be something you could see as a kind of movement that I called a Paschal movement, a kind of movement from death to resurrection in such a way that the resurrection begins to break forth even as Jesus is moving towards his death. So, for example, in the moment in which the woman bathed Jesus' feet with the expensive nard, That is this incredible moment of intimacy. And Jesus even says to his disciples, this woman is anointing me for my burial, at least as we read it in the Gospel of Mark. That veneration of Jesus, that anointing of Jesus, was not merely a harbinger of Jesus' death, but nard, as you know, is a oil that is used actually to help uterine health. It's a kind of oil of Olay for the body. And there's a sense in which when Jesus is bathed with that nard, there's a double symbolism that he's actually getting ready to birth a new world. So you can see in all of this reading, these kinds of harbingers, these foreshadowings, this idea of the resurrection happening right now. And the reason why I think that's important is because keep in mind that the gospel is not like CNN live coverage. There's no embedded reporter in the gospel riding along on the tank or whatever. There's these stories that people began to tell about Jesus, and they had a kind of durability, and then people began to create a kind of account of who Jesus was. And so when they would embed these little symbolic gestures towards the resurrection, they wanted to make a point to us. They wanted us to know that the resurrection is not the anticlimax of this story. The resurrection actually begins now. And so I began to just read the scriptures differently, and this has been kind of like a guilty pleasure, because in Lent you're supposed to be giving up things and coming to terms with your sinful self. But what I began to realize is when I read the scripture from the standpoint of resurrection, I began to see that it wasn't so much that I had to give up something, I actually had to die to something. I had to let it go. And I had to be attentive to all the ways that I had to let certain things die. And some of those things were real life things, like resentments. Many of you know the fact that I haven't made this secret, but I've discovered over the years, not only was there some difficulty between myself and my father growing up, but my father, was not a good dad. He did his best. I love him. He was not a good dad. He didn't know how to nurture. He didn't know how to be there for me. He could get sentimental, but he actually had a completely different life, a different family life, a different woman, and a different city while he was married to my mother. And one of the things that I've been carrying around for, probably 50 years was this kind of weird resentment towards my father. And leaning into the resurrection for me has been learning to both acknowledge that trauma, but to also somehow become attentive to those moments where the reconciliation that is promised in resurrection comes to life in my life. So the other day I was talking to one of my students who I'm teaching from Ecumenical Theological Seminary, and he was young African-American pastor of this church in Detroit, and we began to go through 2 Corinthians, and he says, I'm thinking about my father. My father was cross-addicted, and he was never there for me. And I said to him, well, my father, managed to do a lot of damage with just one addiction. and we had this bonding moment, because he said, I believe that God prepared me to be a pastor by having a father like I had. And one of the things I had to do in my life is go and take him to, I had to honor him on Father's Day. Even though I would have rather have been with my own family, I had to honor him on Father's Day, and he went to a cruise in Detroit. And I was sitting there talking with him, and all of a sudden I just told him I remembered this memory that I had forgotten. And it was a moment of time when I was in my early 20s. And my father wanted to go to an AA meeting, and he wanted me to go with him to this AA meeting because, he just wanted the company or whatever. So I go with him to this AA meeting, and it's this incredible small table, and inside were these people sitting around, and one person came in who was blind. And so he sat down, he couldn't see, and they began to we got there a little late, so we didn't have to go through the usual thing where you identify yourself. And we just came around, and my father spoke, and then this blind participant in the AA meeting spoke. And he began by saying, to my father, whose name is Bill, he says, Bill, I'm so happy to hear about your sobriety. I know how proud you are of your son. And I had never known that I had a life in my father's mind outside of his presence in my life. Do you know what I mean? I never knew he would even talk about me. And the fact that this guy was blind and somehow said this, it was like this confirmation. He wasn't just putting me on. He wasn't just complimenting me. And I told this young guy that this was one of the moments where when I think about my dad, I have to think about that person as well. And it's in moments like that I start to experience resurrection. That's where I start to experience the reconciliation of my relationship with my father. Because what I'm trying to say with this story is that the resurrection is not merely an event or a myth that we have to explain. It's an actual event. It's a part of our world that has been made new through Christ. Jesus is God's reconciliation entering time and space. And when you and I begin to live the Christian life and die to ourselves so we might be reborn to Christ, something magical happens in us. And we are able to kind of see things differently and do things differently. It's Christ who starts to live with us, in us, through us. You see? And that's what it means to experience the resurrection. And that takes practice. I would have not seen that image, that memory of my father and that blind prophet had I not somehow placed myself in that position for some reason to begin to celebrate the victory of life over death in my life. So to practice the resurrection is a kind of spiritual practice. And what I want to say, and I'm just kind of summarizing all the stuff I wrote down, is, one of the things that looking at the scriptures through the eyes of the resurrection helps us to see is that when we love, it's not simply us loving on our own, but the resurrection means that the love that you and I have and share and give, even if it's incredibly broken and small, all of that inkling of love, that is a participation in the love that is stronger than death. Because when Christ was raised from the dead, he renewed all of humanity. He renewed and reconciled all of our history. And so the love that we have now, it's a participation in the resurrecting love of Christ. And when we forgive, it's not simply we forgive because, we have been forgiven, although you'll see that in the scriptures. And it's kind of commanded by Jesus, and Jesus played some, funny math with Peter when he said, how many times do I forgive? 7 times 70, and then people have debated whether that was a finite number or not. Jesus was introducing Peter into a kind of infinite game of forgiveness. So that when we forgive, we actually start to make that reconciling presence of Christ alive in our lives, and that is resurrection. And when we give to someone else, it's not just a transfer of credit or a transfer of services or goods. It's a kind of participation in the kind of generosity that overcomes scarcity and even death in Christ. So, and when we learn to die to ourselves, it's not so much that we go into this zero-sum game where we die in order to have something else or someone else live, but we actually live by dying. That's what it means to be resurrected. Does this make sense, what I'm trying to get at? I'm trying to sneak around this really powerful way of seeing things. And so to practice resurrection, Jennifer was shaking her head, but she was being polite. It's all right. It's gonna be fine. It's gonna be fine. When we begin to practice resurrection, we get to that work internally by actually imaginatively entering the scriptures and kind of going through a kind of performance of the scriptures among us. So one of the things that I want to do tonight is to just go directly into a piece where we can see the resurrection breaking out in really explicit ways before Jesus dies. And that happens in John chapter 11 with the raising of Lazarus. The thing to keep in mind about the raising of Lazarus in the Gospel of John is that in the Gospel of John, that is the event after which the religious authorities decide that Jesus must die. So Jesus seals his fate not when he makes a whip of cords and chases the money changers out of the temple. That's what's said in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But Jesus is actually considered a threat and has to be dealt with when he raises Lazarus from the dead. And that's meant to make a point to us about the resurrection, which is that the resurrection is far more threatening to people than simply misbehaving in church. In fact, in the Gospel of John, why is this funny? I don't know. Jesus actually uses the whip of cords and cleans out the temple in chapter 2. You would think he would have been killed immediately, but in fact he doesn't. Now again, this is making my way back to the point that I made, that the Gospels are not CNN live coverage. They are arranged in such a way because each Gospel writer is trying to make a very true point about Jesus. And John's point about Jesus is that everything hinges upon this moment of resurrection in John 11. And to jump ahead a little bit, what I want you to do is I want to read this, and I'm going to ask ask for a little bit of a change around, have some other people read the next paragraph, and I'm just going to give this to you, and you're going to read it. Is that okay with you? It really doesn't matter. I'm going to do it anyways, but I was just asking for. Yeah, it was a retort. Thank you, Deborah. I'll start us off, and then just be ready. Follow along at home. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill, so the sister sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Just the next paragraph.
Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at the night stumble because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him."
Next paragraph. It's because you're the most extroverted.
Yes,
Yeah.
I know. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world."
Let's do the second one.
When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?"
Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he's been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upwards and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he'd said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go."
Next paragraph.
Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what he had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the council and said, "What are we to do? This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy places and our nations." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was a high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all. You don't understand that it is better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed." He did not say this on his own, but being a high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was about to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but to gather into one the dispersed children of God. So from that day on, they planned to put him to death.
Isn't that amazing? So there's a lot going on in this passage, and it's one of those things that typically when we look at it in church, we don't do that last part, the danger and involved in it, the obviously weird kind of political calculations that Caiaphas has to get involved in. All of this is meant to be a kind of unwitting prophecy to who Jesus is actually. And all of this is meant to kind of spin things. But before I go any further, I want to ask, are there any just simple questions that you might have about this passage? Everybody's got it. Excellent. This will be an easy class. Kate. I know. This is the thing. We tend to skip it in church, which is why Easter is the kind of Jesus coming out of the cake or the box. That's the thing, is it's immediately there that Jesus is seen as a threat. And then, note first, now the term that is used is sigma in the Greek, sign. It's not that Jesus did this incredible miracle, but Jesus did a sign. And signs always have signifiers. They always have a thing they're reaching out to. And so this is threatening. In John, it happens around 18 or 19. So you have a lot of soliloquies, and you have Jesus washing his disciples' feet. You have a lot going on before you get to Jesus' being betrayed and mocked and all that kind of stuff. But this is a pivot point in this gospel. This is similarly in the Gospel of Luke, for example, chapter 9 is the pivot point. Luke 9:51. He set his face like a flint towards Jerusalem, is the actual Greek, and that's a moment where Jesus knows he's going to his death. And here, it's another kind of pivot in the gospel, which means because of the resurrection, now Jesus is a threat. Deborah. Yes. That would be Israel, right? And that was a very complex. So anytime John is doing this is John's reading of what the messianic prophecy should be, because it's probably the case that John did not have access to what Caiaphas actually said. Larry. Priest. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Exactly. And see, this is the thing that I like about the Gospels is there's so many layers that you can read them, because one of my favorite moments is in Luke, I believe, where Herod and Pilate are moving Jesus between their jurisdictions. And they had hated each other until that point, but they keep moving Jesus back and forth because, Herod's like, well, this is not our trouble. He's a political rebel. He goes to the Roman governor, and the Roman governor says, he's just a weird Jewish guy. I'm going to send him back to you. And he's talking about like invisible kingdoms. Obviously he might need some help, but he's not really a threat to me. I've got, soldiers. And so they moved him back and forth, and there's this great moment in Luke where after they move Jesus back and forth and he goes to his crucifixion, it says, from that day forth, the two became friends. They had been enemies until that moment. And so think about the parody of friendship and discipleship. So it's like a parody of Christian discipleship, because in Christian discipleship, we kind of give Christ to one another. So that's all through. And this is why, I think it's scripture because it's kind of cool that this is right under the surface. Any other like things before I want to get us into a quick question? Go ahead, Kate. So that would be, keep in mind that Israel had been conquered twice and that Jews were spread everywhere. Yes. Because if you read Isaiah or Malachi or any of the prophets, the Messiah was meant to kind of reunify the nation. So I want to just take, now there's going to be many other questions here. Oh, yes, Claire. Yeah, and there's a moment in the book of Acts, I think, where he figures as well. It's an interesting question. Obviously Caiaphas was a real person, but whether we know whether or not, this is exactly exactly historical fact on that, we don't know, honestly. Though I know I say that, I want you to know I believe the story to be deeply true. What I want you to do is in your circles, maybe take a moment to just think for a bit and find a character in this passion play, as it were, that you identify with. Think of it through the perspective of what would Mary see and feel and hear? What would Martha see and feel and hear? What would the disciples and Thomas, who Jesus says, Jesus is delaying. He's dawdling. Jesus needs a schedule. Yes, and why are you delaying, Lord? Or look at it from the perspective of Lazarus and talk to each other about why you feel pulled towards that character. And I want to let you know, I know each of you really well. You're all incredibly trustworthy and wonderful. So don't be afraid to be courageously vulnerable. But obviously, if you don't want to go where angels fear to tread, it's fine. And we've got to get Laura. Maybe if you move over here, not to make you move, Laura, but you're the only one. So let's take a few moments and do that in your table discussion. I'm wondering, how many of you looked at things from the perspective of the disciples or Thomas? Donna? And then, do you want to just do a data dump before you go?
I was just talking to our group about how Thomas and the disciples must have felt, because when all of a sudden your leader and the person that you believe in is going to go back and put themselves in probably incredible danger, and you're questioning them as to why you would do that, and you're not getting it, but you're going to follow him anyway. You're kind of, that's a little bit scary, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting it was Thomas, because keep in mind, just not a few chapters later, Thomas is the one who doesn't believe that Jesus is raised from the dead. It's a fascinating thing. So Thomas is willing to go die for Jesus, but whatever, he doesn't believe in him rising from the dead. I kind of have sympathy for Thomas.
So it was actually Claire that was talking about Thomas, and we were just talking about how he was, what was he feeling when Jesus is going back, and then all of a sudden he decides to go with him.
Yeah.
Did he think he was going to die? And we decided no, they just figured he was in for trouble and they'd just go hang with him.
Yeah. But how many people saw Martha as a viewpoint that you found powerful or attractive? Let's start with Kate and move to Coco, and I think it was Mary. Are you gonna? No, she didn't. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I just said I would hope that I would be Martha and recognize that Jesus was the Messiah and make that proclamation.
Interesting.
I've always liked Martha. I thought she got a bad rap when her sister was commended for washing Jesus' feet, and she was ignored for being in the kitchen. So, as you know me well
Yes.
enough to know, I would
Yes.
think Martha was.
Yes.
But in this case, I think she was the one who went to greet him. She was the one who went out while Mary stayed home. And she is so firm always in how she believed in him. She never wavers.
Yes.
And that's here.
So there's a kind of similarity between Martha and Thomas, right? Because Thomas and Martha are kind of using normal human calculations, right? Thomas is like, Lord, this is a bad idea. It's a really bad idea. And Martha's like, yes, Jesus, this is not a time for Sunday school. We've got a death. I know that there is a resurrection, but Mary's really upset. And you waited. Who else wants to say Martha's perspective? Who related to Mary? Oh, Deborah.
Well, Mary's pretty angry. Unlike Martha, she doesn't say, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. She just looks him straight in the eye and says, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And she's upset and pretty angry at him.
Yeah. So some medieval interpreters of this passage have seen this kind of movement from the kind of calculation, the use of the intellect to the use of the heart. And that this is one of those moments in the scriptures where the heart leads. Interestingly enough, because obviously Jesus is affected and Jesus understands Mary.
But she also says, when she says, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died, that means to me that she believes, as Martha does, that he has the power over life and death.
Yes. 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 Although it's funny because who is it that says, don't go there, Jesus, don't open that up, there's going to be a stench? Who does that? It's Martha. Because Martha is thinking, like a normal human being. Who else wants Mary?
Normal human being of Mary. I think she became distrustful, angry, and then after he brought him back, then she regained her personal confidence.
Wow, I really like that. Beverly, that's brilliant. I really like that. Because there's this element of movement, psychological movement that you're putting into the text. Who else liked Mary? Oh, God. That's right. That's right, yes.
This is not a political statement, but I just find it very interesting that the women's voices are the ones that are articulating the issues rather than the dear apostles.
Yes, well, and that's almost always the case for John, right? Because who's the first person to see the resurrected Christ? Mary Magdalene. So if a woman's speaking in John, it's true. It may not. It just matters what kind of truth that's being said. Who related to Lazarus? Marla.
Well, I'd never thought about it before, but after reading the passage, I really started to wonder from Lazarus's perspective, what was it like? The passage doesn't give you the feeling that it was a beautiful, gentle rebirth on sunbeams and that he was restored to the condition of a healthy 20-year-old again.
Right.
Was it a rough passage?
Skin like new.
Yeah, was it rough, and was life after that still kind of rough?
Yeah, well, he had to still face death again.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it was easier, but it was still death. Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure. He was just Thomas called the twin, so the twin might not have been a disciple. That's a great idea, Claire. That's a wonderful idea. Who related with Jesus? Who looked at it from the perspective of Jesus?
Well, this may be a pretty cynical way of looking at it, but Jesus telling Martha and Mary I'm not going to be bothered with this, and I'm going to just let this go, and we'll see what happens. And then, as time goes on, Martha and Mary become more and more upset. And then, to some degree, I believe, Jesus becomes upset because he's doubting the fact that he didn't bring Lazarus back to life when they recommended. But all
Interesting.
along, the situation's building up, so by the time the stone is rolled away, the impact on those around Jesus is considerably stronger than it would have been if he acted right out front.
You're totally, what's interesting about what you're saying that I think is really fascinating for us to notice is that there's obviously a strategy being put in place in the first part of the story. Jesus is choosing when to go and how to go, which any political leader would do that. Any bishop, chooses when she wants to appear and how she wants to appear and with what event. And yet Jesus decides to wait, and it's a costly decision, because by waiting he's allowed himself to die, because it ups the ante. And if you look at the beginning point, one of the things to keep in mind with John is when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death, rather it is for God's glory." Now in the Gospel of John, when Jesus ever says glory or hour, he's speaking about the crucifixion. You can line it up almost perfectly when you look at the whole. And so when Jesus says this is for God's glory, that's a foretaste of his death. And one of the ways that this is kind of a spoiler alert, even though I'm talking about the resurrection as being the main point of this, the trick of Christianity is you don't get resurrection without death. This is not a denial of the cross, but a kind of look at the cross as a kind of movement through space rather than simply something that happened once and for all in 3 hours. And so when Jesus says that his hour has come, he's going to raise the dead, but he's also going to his death. So one of the things that I'm inviting you to do over the next week is reread this passage a few times. Make it a daily practice of rereading it, and take some time to shift the position of the performer that you are seeing yourself through. So by that I mean take a position and look at it first and foremost from the perspective of Thomas and the disciples, and think of all the ways that you tend to kind of rationally calculate your way through your faith. And start to think about what kind of impact that does, what kind of gifts that gives. There's a grace in it, for sure, because we think for a reason. But there's also a limitation to it. You don't actually see resurrection. Because Thomas says, "Let us go and die with him." And then when Thomas is away, when Jesus rises from the dead and appears to them, Thomas doesn't believe the testimony of the disciples. And then maybe look at it through the perspective of Mary or Martha, and think about the kind of tension between Mary and Martha. And it's okay to read it, it's in other Gospels, but there's no way these things kind of echo through the Gospels. They're the same kind of person and the same kind of personality. And there are those of us who are controlling and need to organize things perfectly, and there are those of us who kind of go with the flow and get all the credit, and we who control things and organize things get resentful and feel taken advantage of. This happens. And the funny thing is each of us probably has a little bit of Martha in them at different points. And some of us have a little bit of Mary, unless we have an extreme personality. And that's meant to show to us again another facet of who we are in our lives, the kinds of things that we have to do. Because being Martha is actually a really productive thing to do. I was thinking about a point that Lisa made a lot when we were looking at the first mountain and the second mountain in the class from this fall, that sometimes climbing that first mountain and achieving things for yourself, that's actually your job. And Martha, sometimes, running the church, that's really important to do, right? And Mary, sometimes being Mary is choosing the better portion, as Jesus says. And that's because Mary actually has that intimate encounter with Jesus where she sees him weeping. And there's this kind of divine empathy that is mediated through Jesus. And that divine empathy is in your life. And then finally, look at things from the perspective of Lazarus. Think about what it means to be unbound and set free by learning how to die better. And what does that mean to kind of experience resurrection that way? I want to take a look at some pictures that you can look at as you pray through these things over the next week. So if you look on page 5, this is one of my favorite pieces, and if we get our act together, we've had so much going on these last couple of weeks, I didn't get a chance to throw this up into PowerPoint, but I will at some point. But if you look here, this is Vincent van Gogh's Raising of Lazarus, and this is actually based loosely on a Rembrandt painting from 1630 or so. And in it, Rembrandt does not actually imitate what the painting that came before him, but he actually wants us to not see the Raising of Lazarus as something that is kind of a kind of dramatic moment. For him, so Van Gogh at this point in his life, he is about to die. He dies that same year, and he's been exploring the whole power of color. And so the color yellow was meant to kind of bring forth this kind of vibrancy and energy and love. And Lazarus is kind of being raised, and there's no Jesus depicted, which some have said is meant to be a kind of anti-religious point, but I think they're missing the point when it comes to Van Gogh, because remember that Van Gogh actually was a missionary to coal miners before he became a painter. So I think actually what's going on here are two things. I think this is looked at from the perspective of what Jesus would have seen. This is a point of view of Jesus looking at the raising of Lazarus, because you see the person who is probably Mary and Martha, and then you have this Lazarus coming up from the tomb, and the gravestone pushed to the side, and the sun is shining in the background, and it's meant to kind of recreate some of the things that that Van Gogh would see in his daily life and that he painted. And the key to this painting is the thin red beard that Lazarus has on his chin. Do you know who else had a red beard? Van Gogh, right. So Van Gogh is actually creating this incredibly powerful theological point, which is that he is being raised from the dead, and he is also, in a sense, the painter as well as the viewer are Christ, seeing someone being raised from the dead. It's a really powerful depiction of this passage from John. And so one of the questions you can ask is, what does it mean for me to step into the place of Lazarus? What does it mean for me to be raised from the dead? Another painting I threw for you just because I just couldn't help myself. I went back to the painting that inspired Van Gogh, and this is Rembrandt van Rijn, Raising of Lazarus, 1630 to 1632. And you see an incredibly different depiction of things. You see Jesus almost as if he's doing a Kohen blessing in Judaism. And of course, Rembrandt is the first person to actually paint someone who was ethnically Jewish in the Western canon. Like, he's the first person who said, like, instead of painting Jesus as, a good-looking German guy, maybe we should paint him as, find a Jew and paint him. And so there's this element of a gesture towards that. And then this Lazarus is being kind of raised to joy. It's not the most amazing animation, but it's pretty remarkable because he actually is raising, there's a sense of smile there. Am I mistaking that? But it's like a person who's waking from a fever smile. And then the children are just panicked. And that would be Mary and Martha. Another one that I threw out for you is Sid Hammer from 1964. And you will find this kind of painting about Lazarus all through the 60s. Lazarus was a huge figure in the 1960s and in contemporary art. You can find him again and again and again. And it's here you have this very partial resurrection. And so many of us experience resurrection that's only something in part. And then finally, most recently, Chris O'Feely did the raising of Lazarus. And it's all a kind of beautiful celebration of color and the body. And you could see the prominence of yellow is kind of a gesture towards Van Gogh. There's no way O'Feely could not do that. O'Feely is famous for having done that famous portrait of the Virgin Mary with elephant dung, which was a sign of veneration in certain traditions, but Rudolph Giuliani did not think so. It was in the Brooklyn Museum. It caused a stir. But this is currently on exhibit at the MoMA in New York. And this is meant to kind of create a kind of sense of color and an emphasis on flesh. Because one thing I haven't touched upon is resurrection is not merely afterlife, it's actually a return to the body. And then finally, I went way back into the canon, and I pulled this from the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And this is a classic, unnamed, the healing of the blind man and the raising of Lazarus as two of Jesus' main miracles in the Gospel of John. In John chapter 9, he heals the man who was born blind. And in John chapter 11, he raises Lazarus from the dead. And in each case, there is this kind of movement towards death and resurrection. And there you see Lazarus very much bound by his grave cloths. And the question you have to ask is, are you still bound? Are you still fighting against the grave cloths that are around you? Is it time to start to let someone snip those off? I don't know if any of you have ever been in like bandages and someone comes in and does those cuts. And then go ahead, Claire. It's a diptych, but they're side by side without, they're meant to be that way. Yeah, they're not like someone took two pieces and threw them together. What's fascinating for me about this is if you look at the figure that's right in the middle, there's a tonsure. So the disciples, it's just assumed that the disciples are monastics. And I think that that's actually a connection to why Lazarus is seen as completely bound up in his grave cloths. And it's meant to venerate, I would suggest, the whole idea of, you need to be disciplined or else we're going to have to just keep you in a straitjacket. Truth be told, I really do think that that's operative. But my rantings get raves. So all of those are meant to kind of give you some picture. Now, I know a lot of you, or I'm suspecting that a lot of you heard me begin with this incredibly personal story, and then we moved into this kind of powerful scripture passage. And I want you to feel comfortable seeing yourself in the story. And so that's what I mean by looking at the different characters. Read it over. Think about where you might be in the story. There's no test. I'm not going to come back next week and say, and Mark, what embarrassing family secret can you share about your encounter with resurrection? But I believe that part of what it means to grow spiritually is actually to develop that kind of facility, to see yourself in the Scriptures and the Scriptures in yourself until you are changed fully by Christ. Thanks.